Hello, we're here with Jessica Powers at the American Library Association in San Diego. Hello, Jessica.
Hi.
You want to tell us about your book?
Okay, I'm Jessica Powers, and my book, this thing called The Future, is set in post-apartheid South Africa. It's a love story and a coming-of-age story, and just as 14-year-old Khosi Zulu, the protagonist of this thing called The Future, starts falling in love for the first time, she is haunted by a witch's curse, a supernatural stalker, and the looming death of someone she loves. I wrote it because I fell in love with African women and African young women, and because I grew very concerned about the HIV/AIDS crisis that's occurring there, and because I love South Africa generally, and I wanted to write about a modern South African teenager and all the problems that she encounters.
So how do you know about South Africa?
Well, South Africa has become probably the other love of my life besides the U.S.-Mexico border. I started studying it in 1999 when I started an African history master's degree program at the State University of New York, Albany. And I continued that with a PhD program at Stanford University in African history, which I didn't finish the PhD because I left it for my writing career. But I spent many years studying the Zulu language and studying South African history. And I went over to South Africa in 2006 for a Fulbright Hays Zulu language study program. And I lived with a Zulu family. My 14 and 13-year-old sisters would come into my room at night and get onto my bed and tell me all about their boyfriends and how they were VIPs at the local parties. And I grew very concerned because their boyfriends were, they were sugar daddies. They were older men, but they didn't want to talk about HIV/AIDS at the time. And I knew the statistics. I knew that young women between the ages of 15 and 35 in South Africa these days have a 30 to 35% chance of being HIV positive. And because I love these girls, I knew that they were at risk, and so I started studying the problem of HIV/AIDS. But I also grew very interested in traditional healing because South Africa has a really interesting problem in that with as many millions of people that are HIV positive, they only have 32,000 medical doctors, and most of those medical doctors don't service the public service sector. They do not help the people that are actually HIV positive, who are often poor and going to the public hospitals. But there are 300,000 traditional healers, and so what a lot of the medical doctors in the public service sector are doing are working with traditional healers. The government has started certifying traditional healers to work with HIV/AIDS patients, or to work with medical doctors to recognize the symptoms of HIV/AIDS and to get them into medical treatment with medical doctors.
So, how did you do? It's real curious to me. How did you develop a story from all that you've learned about the history of HIV and of South Africa? How did the story come about?
Well, it grew in layers. I knew I wanted to write a story about a young girl who is affected by HIV/AIDS in some way, a relative or herself or something. And as I started, and I also knew that I wanted to think about traditional healing, and I knew that there's a huge problem in the townships these days of witchcraft, that people are cursing their neighbors using witchcraft. People are afraid that they've been cursed by witchcraft, and this creates a lot of violence. And I also knew that traditional healers are a big foundation of the community. And so as I started writing this story about this young woman who is affected by HIV/AIDS in some way, the elements of witchcraft and traditional healing just sort of began to be layered into the story. And I wanted to be a story of hope. I didn't want, people tend to think of HIV/AIDS as this sort of hopeless scenario that inevitably ends in death. And while that's true much of the time, there's also a great deal of hope. And so this thing called The Future was created over several years of just thinking about what would happen to a 14-year-old young woman who is surrounded by people who are HIV positive, is worried about the possibility that her family's been cursed by a witch, is falling in love with a young man, and how, if she's falling in love with a young man and she knows that HIV is a problem, how does she deal with that? And these questions just all came together to create this book, this thing called The Future.
Now, I know that you've had people read this book, South Africans read this book, and people that you admire. What are their response to the book?
Oh, they've said it's awesome, which just relieves me so much and makes me so proud of it. I've worked very, very hard to. I've done a lot of research and spent a lot of time in South Africa. I just wanted it to be authentic culturally, and I wanted it to also be something that South Africans would recognize as realistic and that they would love and embrace themselves. And so that's meant the world to me, that the friends that I have who are South African and the friends that I have who are academics, getting their PhDs or finishing up or with PhDs in South African culture and history, that they've just loved it and embraced it and said it's great. So that's just meant so much to me.
Well, congratulations on your book. And when's it out, by the way?
This thing called The Future is coming out in April of 2011.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
There you go.